Hi there. Just want to take you through a little more detail around three different approaches to using questions within coaching. So we've talked a little bit about open questions and non-leading questions already. And we've talked a little bit about how we've got some structure. So we talked about Tigro and Oscar. And for those of you that have already looked at the STEP model, there are some questions that could be around the structure. So if you're looking at grow, for example, you might say, well, what's your goal? What's the goal that you have got for this session? What's the goal you've got longer term in terms of the topic that we're talking about? What's the current reality? What's happening now? Tell me some more about what's happening now. So you've got some questions that you could use around the structure. So when you get to options, it's like, what are your options? Or if you're using Oscar, what are your choices that you've got and what are the consequences of those choices? And then you get to actions or will, and you say, what will you do next? What actions will you take? So you can use questions that are really, really deliberately linked around the structure, which is okay if that particular coaching conversation you're having is formal or it is following that structure. But that's not always the case. Another way of viewing questions is around what we call logical and creative. So logical questions are much more to do with the facts. So some of those that we talked about in terms of the following the structure. So what are the facts? What have you already done? What will you do next? Who's involved? What's happening? So there's these logical things. What could you do next? What could you do to improve things? So they're all logical step. This is what follows next. But we have some creative questions that we can ask as well. And part of the role of the creative question is to move people away from their habitual way of solving problems, to get them to think differently about their problem or the situation or themselves within it. And the different ways we might talk about this is exploring possibilities, working with emotions, developing imagination, recognizing guide, using senses, and clean language. So let's have a look at those in a bit more detail. So if we're looking at exploring possibilities, we could be asking questions about what ideas are you playing with at the moment? What are some of the crazier things you have considered? What else could you try? What else? What would you really like to try? Oh, yeah. And then you move into this, you can get into this stuff about developing imagination. So what if you had a blank piece of paper? A magic wand? In an ideal world, where would you start? What if you were to have another 10 people or another 6 months? What would you do? Yeah, so you're trying to expand their thinking. So if you're working with emotions, how do you feel? How are your team feeling? What reaction might you get to this solution or this idea that you've got? What bothers you most about this? What concerns does this bring up for you? So they're all emotional. They're not about what you're going to do next. It's about your emotions or the other people's emotions. Senses. What is your instinct telling you? What's your gut feeling? What does the ideal solution look, sound, feel, taste, or smell like? Sometimes a useful question that you can ask someone is, especially if they've got this meaty thing they just don't know what to do with, ask them what colour it is. Oh, it's black. Well, tell me a bit more about what's black about it. So you're getting them to explore slightly differently than they might traditionally. Recognizing guides. So what would this person who you really admire, this head teacher that you really admire, or your peer that you really admire, or a friend, or your influencer on YouTube or whatever, or social media, what would they do? What values or principles could you use to guide you? What would best serve the organization's purpose, vision, mission, goals? So what you're trying to do, you're trying to get them to stop thinking just about them, but what would others say about this? What values does the organisation have, or you have, and how might that steer what they might do? And the last one about clean language. Sometimes we hear people talk about metaphors, so I feel like I've hit a brick wall. So one of the things we can do is we can stay with the metaphor. Ask about the brick wall. So ask them, what colour are the bricks? How big are the bricks? How long has the brick wall been there? How tall is it? Is there a door in it? How could you get around it? So you stay with the metaphor. So notice metaphors that they're using. And so that's another way we can use questions. So ask them about the metaphor. And the final thing about it is about thinking about what's the source of your questioning. And this is more about probably just being aware. So is your questioning wanting to fix? Are you trying to fix it? So have you tried this? Have you spoken to this person? Yeah, so you're trying to fix. You can be aware, oh, I'm trying to fix here. Okay, so let's move away from that fixing. Or is it the source of your questioning just listening? Oh, I'm really interested in that. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? That sounded really important to you. So your questions support your listening. And then invasive. Are your questions being a bit too invasive? And one sort of clue that we're being a bit invasive is that we use the word why. Why did you do that? Why did you say that? Oh, being a bit too challenging. Yeah? And then evasive. So our questions, we're avoiding asking the uncomfortable question. One of the sort of rules of thumb that I use around if I'm coaching people is that I know there's a good question somewhere if my knees go weak, because I feel like, oh, we're getting something uncomfortable here. And is my question going to go into that uncomfortableness, or am I going to evade it? I'm going to avoid it. So again, we can use these. We can think about our questions in terms of fixing, listening, invasive or evasive. So Rudyard Kipling talked about his honest serving men. I keep 6 honest serving men. They taught me all I know. The names are what, why, and when, and how, and where, and who. I think they're really useful questions. What questions and when questions, how questions, where questions, who questions are really helpful. Why questions are really useful, but be a little bit cautious because they can be a bit judgmental, and they can be a bit cyclical. Well, why did you do that? I just did. Well, why? Well, it felt like the right thing to do. So you can go around in a circle. Or why did you do that? Oh, what do you mean? Oh, it feels a bit challenging. But if you ask them what they did, when did they do it? How did it impact them and others when they did that? What was the impact of that? Who did it impact? Where was the greatest impact? So you're asking questions about it. It helps them to explore and to explore in more depth. So there you have some different approaches to questions. Some around structure, and you find some more in the workbook. Some questions framed around type, so creative or logical, and then questions from source and intention. So hopefully that'll help you as you start to build a bank. Sometimes people talk about your bank of questions and the approaches that you take to using questions.